have an interesting class today.
And you're getting something that's hot off the press.
Oh,
so
yeah.
we're talking about
Yeah.
scribble notes and
Oh,
whatnot.
yeah.
If you wanted fancier PowerPointing,
It's not going to happen today.
It's giving you a sense of how kind of fresh off the press this stuff is. So this is the overall presentation. You guys can get a bird's eye view of this, right?
And this is actually, I know Christy's probably laughing, right? This is actually edited down. This is not as overwhelming as it looks. Trust me, it's a heavy topic, but.
And so we're going to probably around slide 15 here, a little preview into next week's topic, but let me go into, oops, sorry, I didn't do that right. So this topic itself, it's fascinating. The notion of conflict, right? And I think some people, when you hear the word conflict, it almost is like, I think the equivalent of yelling fire, right? It's like run. Yeah. Right? Conflict. What? Conflict? Who? Where? Run. And so we're going to do something this week different than next week. Next week, we're going to cover the exact same topic and teaching you how to avoid or how to not avoid conflict. Yeah. But we're kind of taking more of a facetious point of view here. We're going to help you how to even do this more, which is how do I avoid conflict? We're
going to teach you how to be really bad.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's interesting here where this little diagram maybe makes you think a little bit. If you avoid conflict to keep the peace, you start a war inside yourself. We read that, we're like, wow, that's pretty deep. I don't even know what it means, but it's pretty deep. So we thought we'll share that with you and let that sit and marinate with you, that if you avoid conflict to keep the peace, you start a war inside yourself. One way I think of conflict, or even the act of resolving conflict, is that it's trying to strike a balance between self-advocacy and empathy. Self-advocacy is closer to the character trait of confidence, kind of what I want, my point of view. Empathy is truly understanding the other person's point of view around the character trait of humility. And the act of trying to strike a balance between those two things is a very messy and a very imbalanced process. And that is something that takes so much emotional energy, most of us would rather not engage. Would rather hit eject, right? Just like fire alarm, get out the building.
Run away.
So going into this, I want to start off by trying to understand the notions of avoiding conflict by sharing a blog post that just came yesterday from a guy named Seth Godin. He's written a couple different books and blogs every day, but it just happened to be yesterday as we're preparing this. This is what he wrote, which is understanding the automatic self. How do you act when you're not thinking about how you act? As in when no one is looking and when you're not just doing what you're doing, or sorry, when you're just doing what you're doing, meaning it's the automatic self, no narrative, no second guessing, it just happens. Now I'm going to show you what the rest of the thing that he wrote, you can just read it real quick. Give you a second. Shayla, I'm seeing it, so give me a thumbs up once you've read it so I know when to move on. All right, so everyone can read it, at least at Shayla's pace. We're moving on here. But this idea of understanding, we all have an automatic self. And in fact, what we have found in the research work is that 95% of what we do as human beings is actually closely tied to the automatic self. When we even hear this class or watch a video, read a book and do one of those aha moments, that's around 5% of our memory bank, of our behaviors, of our brain power. 95% is happening so automatic. Often we can't even see and recognize what we're doing. Now, of course, when you work with some of the best in the world, they spend time unpacking and understanding, not only being aware of what their automatic is, working continuously to upgrade that. Now, within the automatic, there's of course good, but there's also bad. So we literally Google searched and looked up, right? This notion of, the automatic self is usually what we call habits. They say the difference of a ritual versus a habit. The ritual you have to push yourself to do, but once it becomes ritualized, it becomes a habit. It pulls you to do it. It becomes automatic. So this question of why is it hard to break a habit? Now, this some of you may know, but many of you probably won't, which is what this thing said was another thing that makes habits especially hard to break is that replacing a first learned habit with a new one doesn't erase the original behavior. Rather, both remain in your brain. So think about that, right? If you have a bad habit that you built and it has become part of your automatic, you can put another habit in to counteract it. But that old habit doesn't disappear. It's there permanently. And you know this idea of a relapse, right? Yeah. If you were like a like binge eater at midnight, and that's kind of what your thing was, and then you learned over time that it's really bad for you, and you found a way to dial that down by going to bed early or whatnot, at some point, you know, when you have those breakdowns, you regress and you go back into massive midnight eating, that old habit is in there. And there's a constant battle, right? Of your own mind in its automatic form, drawn to whether it's the midnight eating, whether it's the alcohol, whatever it might be that you did, drawn to it. And you can work really hard to build a new ritual, insert it that becomes a habit, but recognizing there's always a battle, right? It's like muscles. And as the new muscle is stronger, which is what we call the 51% stronger than the old muscle, which might in relative terms get to be 49%, the new will win. But if you don't exercise that new and it regresses, like most muscles atrophy, the old can often come right back in.
Well, we're going to teach next week more around the habits, what to do this the right way. But you know, the willpower, they always say willpower is for suckers. It doesn't work. It's like, I just won't do that this time, right? And so we're going to spend more time on that next week. We're going to first go into how to do this really wrong.
All right, so this is now the easier to read, fancy part of the presentation done. So we're going to go into more of the handwritten stuff. So show you how new this stuff is. This is Megan's handwriting. So if you can't read it, you blame her, not me, right?
Was not intended for this presentation, but you know.
We're going to walk you through here 5 ways to basically avoid conflict. 5 of the most common ways that we have done something so ritualized, so, you know, habitualized, that often we don't even realize some of these 5 things we do, if not all of them, are the very things that make us consistently and continually avoid conflict. Said another way, we're going to walk you through and give you 5 strategies to be really bad. Now, I'll tell you towards the end of the presentation why avoiding conflict is so bad, but 5 strategies to avoid conflict, 5 strategies to be really bad. So let's jump right into the first one. So the very first one, a word that often we've heard a lot, many of us, is the word ruminate. When you think of ruminate, you're thinking about the past, but nobody thinks of the word ruminate in a positive sense. Ruminate usually is on the negative stuff. I think about when we ruminate, in this notion of conflict, we think about and keep thinking about and feeding energy into the past memories of when conflict went wrong. When I put the energy into something that created conflict and things went wrong. So what I'm showing you in this horribly messy, but maybe beautiful handwritten diagram, which one day might be in the art exhibits, so keep that in mind. They all look like this. I always think about this insight we had when we went to and spent time in Parris Island watching how they train Marines. And we just spent days there just grilling the instructors. How do you train 18-year-old boys, 18-year-old girls coming in? Not only to put their own lives in danger, right? But to actually take another life. I mean, how do you cross that threshold? And they talked to us about how much we as human beings are storytellers. Like we remember visuals, we remember movies. They were saying that the movie Saving Private Ryan was such a big coup for the military because that gave people sort of the visual, like they can remember and recall of what to do in what is such a crazy, startling, life-threatening, take others' life, risk my life situation. And this idea that we are playing movies constantly in our head. But in those movies, so on the topic of conflict, we have movies that sound like failure or actually feel like failure, and they're movies of success.
But real movies of things, experiences that have happened to us.
You're like replaying it, right? And you know, when you keep replaying, you know, your old movies, they actually alter. They alter and change every time you think about it. Now, one of the top ways that conflict is avoided is when you go and actually inventory the number of examples on the left side here. So things when conflict went wrong. There's a list, and you have these great detailed stories that you remember.
These are
right?
more, you don't have to look at the bullets, just so you know, we're working on mine. Like the mental models I have are the past stories that I ruminated on of when conflict went wrong, which then tells me, don't do that again, right?
Mhm.
It's like a really bad, I remember that. I could play out the whole scenario from beginning to end, the consequence, the whole nine, and saying that movie, don't replay that movie. I don't want that to
And it's
happen
this
again.
idea, that's what they call a mental model.
Yeah.
These movies of the memories we have and whether it's succeeding or failing make us automatically either run away if it's failing,
Yeah.
if it's succeeding, pursue it aggressively. And the key here is this: when we try to map this out, in this case, no name person named Megan, but like there was an imbalance. There's an imbalance when it comes to conflict. Looking on the left, there were some clear memories that popped up in a lot of detail, but on the right side, it was very empty.
Mhm.
So
In terms
one
of
way,
conflict,
in
we're
terms of
all
conflict.
about talking about
So
conflict.
if you want to avoid conflict, have an imbalanced memory
Mhm.
on what happens in conflict. And that imbalanced memory, heavy in rumination, is every time I did not work. And you remember excruciating detail, and you look on the side of, well, are there times where I poured energy into conflict, it went well,
Yeah.
and I'm seeing pretty blank.
Yeah.
That imbalanced
Yeah.
memory of what happened when you faced or went into conflict, that is a way to continue to avoid conflict.
Mhm.
So once again, oftentimes we're not aware of it, but hopefully you'll become aware that at least if you want to avoid conflict, you're doing it deliberately. Keep writing more stories on the left, and you will definitely keep avoiding conflict.
Mhm.
All right, number two. Number two has to do with another imbalance. So these are all 5 imbalances. This is a diagram we had used before. We use this term 300 meters out, being like very far out, versus like the notion of in the near vicinity is like 10 meters out, 10 to 30 maybe, versus going really far out. The notion of the word consequences. So if rumination is going backwards on the negative stuff, consequences is typically used with negative stuff looking forward. When we overly predict consequences of things we are doing today, right? The consequence of me going into this conflict will be, boom, happens here, this happens here, and I start to overly predict what's going to happen. Like I become this magical fortune teller where most of life seems to kind of be known for me,
Mhm.
right? In development world terms, they call that the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset, meaning like, imagine if your life's already decided. No matter what you do, right? It's almost like a pretty clear path of what's in front of you.
Mhm.
So the future really is not something you can shape. It's already been decided, and it's just the path you're just going to walk down on, practically an autopilot. That is what happens when you have an imbalanced amount of energy, thinking about the consequences looking forward. So the right balance is approximately 5%. If you are spending much more than 5% of your time in detail predicting what's going to happen and looking forward, you are in an imbalanced fashion, basically convincing yourself, don't go into that, don't action, don't do this, because everything bad will happen.
Mhm.
If you knew bad things were going to happen, why would you even bother? Save your energy, don't engage.
Right.
So this notion of consequences overly predicted beyond even 5%, which is a tiny number.
Right. It's like when you play out the scenario. If I say this, he's going to be upset about that. And then she's going to do this. And then when that happens, that's going to, it's the opposite of ruminating going back. We were trying to think about the language of what's the equivalent of ruminate in the future, which is just consequences overly done. It's just playing out the future. And at some point you actually believe that's real. And so you say, so that's why I'm not going to engage in that conversation, because nothing good is going to come out of that. Right?
Yes.
And they're going to avoid that conflict. There's no point.
And it's amazing how people do this so often and so easily.
Yeah.
And I remember the number of people we have coached and said, God, like you have a crystal ball that is far superior to anybody I've seen, because you already know what everyone is thinking and doing. And you pretty much seem to know every variable looking into the future.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, wake up,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like,
Sometimes I like to show you my crystal ball and say, yes, yes, I do. This is exactly
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Because it feels so real. I'm like, I've seen this movie play out before, but the reality is it's not the exact same movie,
and
right?
it's
But I've convinced
impossible.
myself it's pretty close.
The world's
sounds-
gotten more complex, and anybody who actually is predicting too far out
Right.
and in too much detail, usually for me is a litmus test for a red flag
Yeah,
that this person, right,
overdoing.
is overdoing this future, forecasting. As a result of it, they're
Yes.
convincing themselves to do nothing now.
Nothing.
Practically no action now. Why bother, since I'm going to lose anyways? Why bother, because they're going to quit anyways? Why bother? Like,
Right.
everything is a why bother, because I already know how it plays out.
Mm-hmm.
So
Leads to nothing good.
yeah, does not do
Yeah.
good things. But if you want to keep avoiding conflict, do more of that. A lot more than 5%. If you can get up to 80%, whoa, you will definitely be a conflict avoider. All right. This slide, we gave a presentation in one of the earlier LIP classes. I think it was LIP 20, around EQ.
Mhm.
So I put the same image here, EQ versus IQ, but I think about this notion of going for the what they call the system two, the logical, the technical solution, meaning you will be surprised in today's day and age, almost anything difficult, whether it's a product, whether it's a business plan, a strategy, like even anything with another human being, if you could go into the emotional side of it, and what's happening, the psychology, the EQ, you could probably get to a place of getting better than wherever you are. I'm not even going to say the word solved. You'll get better than wherever you are. But that takes a lot of energy. Oftentimes the phrase we use is that's a lot of drama. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy to muster up with a lot of risk. I'd rather avoid that pain, avoid that energy spend, avoid that drama. And so can we find a technical solution?
Yeah.
Is there some 1, 2, 3 steps they can do that helps them get out of this? Maybe if you just give them a nutrition program, a sleep program, a workout program, maybe just go and read these 1, 2, 3 books.
Mhm.
Like, we look for any solution besides the E, besides the emotion.
Mhm.
And so if you find yourself doing that, right, in your automatic, constantly looking for the next technical pill
Yeah.
solution to solve what is actually to get into that messy human EQ and emotion with another human being.
Yeah. I like what David is asking, sorry, because David, you're asking is conflict with yourself. And someone else, I think Marie was saying, lots of times conflict is within yourself, right? But David is saying, is conflict with yourself a contributor to procrastination?
So conflict within yourself is what we covered quite a bit in the earlier classes around our emotions and being what we call emotional tilt.
Right.
When you have conflict within yourself is what we call emotional tilt. It's a fight or flight.
Mm-hmm.
The top things we talked about was when you are, I think the last class we talked about desperation and shame as probably the two mother of all internal conflicts.
Yes.
Related to desperation is being angry, frustrated, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it leads to a reckless act that we tend to regret later on.
Or complete paralysis and doing nothing.
Flip side, that's a shame.
Mm-hmm.
Sad, shame, embarrassed,
Lindsay's
scared.
saying overwhelmed and flooded and ineffective. Yeah,
Yes.
you become ineffective. That's
Yes.
what shame and desperation does. Right?
So conflict within self generally looks like that in
Right.
one of those two directions. And you often flip flop. You'll see the person go from being reckless to paralyzed.
Yeah.
You'll see them go from, being desperate actions aggressively versus the shut down, ashamed, quiet, and they flip flop. And can you imagine when two people and so by the way, that's what we call the moat, right? The mother of all
thematic
errors is the inability to basically reduce your own moat.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, as human beings, every day is raining and the moat is growing. Every day is a rainy day and the moat grows. And probably the only way the moat would not grow is if you manage to completely get off Wi-Fi and just completely did not see another human being and just locked yourself up and had no clue what everyone else is doing.
Mm-hmm.
The very act of seeing another human being begins the growth of moat. The very act of even reading about another human being grows the moat because we are comparison animals. We compare how we're doing relative to other people. Now, on one hand, the pandemic has been interesting because they say in school, a lot of students who had a lot of anxiety, right?
Yeah.
Social comparison are doing better right now and thriving in this online learning, not having that piece. Now, except for the fact that social media and all that stuff is quite deadly. I think some of you maybe not seeing colleagues or not seeing other people, maybe are doing better in some ways, aren't realizing what you're missing out on and whatnot. So we're all kind of locked up. But then you have Wi-Fi. If you could shut off your Wi-Fi, you might have a slower growing moat. But given that we have Wi-Fi and read about everything out there, our moat is growing
Every day.
all the time.
Mhm.
And when you have two people who have moats that are growing and undealt with come together on anything conflict oriented, you can imagine the top thing they do: eject. Fire alarms going off. We got to get out of this building, right? Do not face conflict.
Yeah.
So just keep all of that in mind. This is all same topic, same theme in different ways.
So this next one, if we're going to number 4, Chris Pittsburgh, I love what he's saying because this is getting right to the next one. Chris is saying, if you know someone really well, you're gonna love this. You're gonna love this relative to what happened yesterday. I fell into this trap. If you know someone really well, you should know the 95% automatic and probably predict what's going to happen. That probably fuels the consequence avoidance, conflict avoidance, right? You're trying to avoid you. I've seen this movie. I know what's going to happen when I say this to that person. So
yes.
This is very related to what we're going to talk about here, right? Expectations and
here's it's kind of closely tied to the idea of the crystal ball.
Yeah.
And we actually put this later on. I think it was actually, I think I was going to cover it later on a little bit. Okay. Think about couples, right? If whether you have either, you can be dating, right? Or you could be obviously married, even family, right? If you know your parents, right? That fight you have with your parents, right? Sorry, Shayla, I know with a daughter, you had a lot of this in the beginning, right? That mother-daughter battles. And I remember a friend of mine, I think Greg, he might even be here right now in the scholars, but said, oftentimes when you're married, especially as couples, you can fight unfairly because you know each other so well, right? You know how to hit below the belt. You know how to hurt them the most, and they know how to do the same, right? And they know how to kind of, if you say I made a mistake, you're like, no, it's not a mistake. You've done this 6 other times, and they have memories and whatnot. And it's interesting, this idea that as couples, we can fight unfairly, so it suggests don't fight.
Right.
So have you ever considered maybe the flip side? If we actually did the reverse, which is if we went into the conflict more often, what would that produce? Which sounds so crazy, we almost don't do it. But this idea that the more you know of someone, you have a view of their past. You have data points of what they've done. When they say I'm doing this I made a mistake, you're like, it's not a mistake when you've repeated it so many times. But you can almost predict more accurately into the future.
Right.
But so however, right, we all have faulty memories and we're all not good fortune tellers, right? And people do change. So what's unfair in what we're doing is remembering the past skewed to our biases, forecasting their future as if they could never do anything but that. And by not going into the conflict and sharing it, in many ways, it doesn't give the other person the chance to correct. Right. Sometimes the best thing that we can do for someone else, this is what they call feedback, is getting the help of someone else to say, hey, you're about to make the same mistake, right? As I opened the bag of chips around 11:50 for my wife to say, are you sure you want to do this? Because you keep regretting. And then at that juncture, you could actually close it up and decide, I'm not going to make that mistake again. We need the help of other human beings because we all have blind spots. We all have biases. But this idea of going into conflict is to put out your thoughts, let them react. And that action of reacting and getting, it's almost like amazing. If you do this right, you will see no matter what you remembered, it was not perfect. In fact, you may get up to half of it wrong. And then no matter what you predicted, although you might have gone half right, another half is wrong. The idea of being open-minded both ways into the past and the future. So I bring back a class we had shared, I think this was LIP 17, around frustration and expectation. There's an individual who spent quite a bit of time named Wes Moore, who's become very successful. And so if you want, you can go back and see it. But the bottom line is there's 2 individuals, exact same name. One is what I call Prison Wes Moore, because he's spending lifetime in prison. The other one is the Wes Moore that got a White House Fellowship, Rhodes Scholarship. He's now the CEO of one of the biggest nonprofits in the world. So I met the Wes Moore who's in the White House, Wes Moore. So I'm just calling it the White House Westmore versus the prison Westmore. And the biggest insight and learning he's had in his life, understanding the differences of how do basically two seemingly similar Black kids, single mother, growing up in the poorest of neighborhoods in Baltimore, end up in such different paths. And the real conclusion they got to was this: the people we keep closest to us, the ones we go for counsel and advice, over time, it shapes us in a direction. Meaning, the Westmore I know, White House Westmore, surrounded himself with a few people who basically said, this doesn't have to define you. You can become better. And pushed despite all odds. The prison Westmore had people around that said, you will become a criminal and you will spend, forever in drugs and the whole 9 yards and life imprisonment. It's exactly what he became. So this idea of expectations. So why do we have expectations and over time trend people to prison Westmore versus the White House Westmore? So we wrote a couple of things here. A phrase we use when we see someone in difficulty is, I don't want to make it worse, right? I know we've all done this. You see something happening, they're not doing well, and our thinking is, I have some things I could tell them to maybe correct, a few things I see wrong, but they're in a lot of pain, a lot of trouble. I don't want to make it worse. And here's what you're saying in essence. They're incapable. They can't handle the truth. They can only take lies. And what ends up happening to individuals who we keep believing they're incapable and we keep not giving them the hard truth and keep feeding them lies. No, don't be so hard on yourself. You had a bum deal. Unfortunately, just, don't be so hard. When you really want to say, stop doing drugs, right? Or stop doing this, stop hanging out with those bad friends, whatever it might be. Remember, that's a choice you make. And if you make the choice of, I don't want to make it worse, and you say to yourself, basically, they can't handle the truth, they can only take lies, recognize what you're doing. Whoever you are coaching, helping, advising, you're turning them into prison Westmore. So once again, an easy way to avoid conflict consistently is think of people, right, as incapable, can't handle truth, only lies, right? You don't want to make it worse. And think of creating prison Westmores.
Yeah, because the language of saying, I don't want to make it worse, and then you coddle them, there's a softness to that. And it's hard for people to even challenge that. But when you change that language to, they're now incapable, they can't handle the truth, and then think of the prison Westmore. Again, this is all mindset work, right? Which is why we're saying habits are very hard to break. But that, just changing that language from I'm coddling to I'm saying they're incapable, they're fixed and they can't change, very different. Can only take lies.
So then I'm going to give you there's many different variations of this notion and expectation, but here's another one that happens often for managers. It's usually called micromanagement. But so if you want to not avoid conflict, this is what you'd have to do. You have to give someone the truth, right? And sometimes the truth is simply good or bad. You say not good. If you can't say bad, just say not good. Or if it's good, say good. But we don't want to give the score because that's kind of harsh. So if you want to not avoid conflict, you want to give the truth and do more of that than what to do. I don't know if that makes sense. This idea of
just saying, if you don't give someone truth as a manager and you think their work is bad, but you don't tell them that, you end up doing, just go do this. You find a way to micromanage it.
If you want to keep avoiding conflict, do this. Right. Leave out the truth. Good or bad, leave it out. Instead, tell them what to do. Right? They're not quite sure why you're giving them this micro instructions, but oftentimes the reason we do it is so that we don't have to have another conversation or another conflict. If I can give you more detail of what to do, right? And usually the person receiving it's like, I thought I did a good job. I'm not quite sure why you're telling me to go do this. And you're like, well, I want you to do this. Did you get that instruction? No. Can you make sure you check this and you give specific things and then come back to me? And it's our passive aggressive way, often as leaders or managers, to avoid the future conflict of them coming back, doing it wrong. So I gave them the micro instruction. Because what would create more conflict is saying, that was really bad what you did. Do it again. What should I do?
Try again.
I don't know, but try again. Whoa, now they're going to come back with another thing that was wrong, and you're going to have to go through conflict on that. And how many iterations? So it's a lot easier saying, I'm not going to hurt their feelings. So no truth, right, on the score. But I'm going to give them detailed micro instruction on what to do.
I think that's spot on with the passive aggressive way to avoid future conflict.
Yeah.
You're trying to avoid the conflict, but you're doing the exact wrong thing. That's just delaying the future conflict, and actually makes it worse because now they feel duped or misled. So now there's even more conflict, and you might feel guilty. You might be even more frustrated or forget it. It's like,
yes,
it actually magnifies it.
Then there's one more added in here that might help a little bit. So oftentimes we'll say, I don't have the results. I'm not on fire. I'm not doing that well. So I don't really have the creds to speak. But in front of my eyes, I see bad happening. I see someone making mistakes, but I'm not going to correct it because I don't have the creds to speak. This idea that, the hardest thing to find is objectivity, right? Meaning we can't get objective usually on things too close to us. The closest thing to us is self. So self-objectivity, hardest thing in the world, self-awareness. Then the people that are really close, whether it's like your spouse or your child or your, sibling, parents, like gets hard because they're close. Not as hard as self, but hard. But the further you go away, right? You can see what they can't see. So as long as it's not self, we are more objective on everybody around us more than they can be objective on themselves. But we narrate for ourselves that, I'm not doing so well. I'm not feeling so good. So despite me seeing them doing wrong, I'm not going to speak to correct them. I see bad, I'm just going to let it go. Which in many ways, for some people, is an endorsement to continue doing what they're doing. Right? Do you ever have a friend who tells horrible jokes, horrible stories, and you don't tell them to stop, and so they keep going? And the worst thing is you might even do a fake laugh, right? You might even compliment them, right? Oh, I really appreciate the story. When all you really want to say is, oh my God, for the 12th time, please stop doing this. Like, now that's a little harsh, but like my point being, you see bad, but you convince yourself you're not going to correct it because you don't have the creds to speak. So do any of these three things over and over again, right? You're going to find a way to build a habit of avoiding conflict.
Mary's saying that she asked a question several weeks ago about how to keep my manager from hovering. And this explains it so well, right? Because they're hovering because they feel that they can't give you the full truth, right? If you invite the truth, you want the feedback, you want the critical feedback, they won't hover.
Right.
But they're hovering because they feel like they have to make it happen. And
that's a perfect example of no truth, right? They're just hovering.
Hovering.
Why are you hovering when I seem to be doing an okay job?
Right.
And then like, why are you like all tense and moving my elbow and telling me to like, I thought like, this is my job, right? Don't you trust me? Oh, I trust you. But like they're hovering. That's that avoidance of conflict. People avoid conflict everywhere. Number 5. This is someone we know named Tom, but it could be a fake name. So just think of Thomas the Train. Optics versus the right thing. This is one of the most common errors people make. When you think of something difficult or something challenging happening, one of the first things people do is they work backwards from what the optics are. What's the narrative? What's the explanation? How would you start there and you get so lost in that, you never get to think about what's the right thing to do. And if you have that habit, you'll see based on where you start, number 1, is where you end up actually going. 1 is usually almost always a conflict avoidance, just muscle building. Like I think of like bench pressing, conflict avoidance. That's starting with optics. Versus what's so much harder for people to do is saying, okay, I'm going to put the optics aside. I'm going to put aside how I look, how everyone looks, feelings I hurt. I'm going to say, what would be the right thing to do? And once you spend enough time there, then you go into, okay, so before we action it, this is the idea of the OODA loop,
right?
How we should think about the optics, because words do matter, right? Tone does matter, all these things, but
secondary to getting the right thing figured out.
But if you flip it, you will build a bad habit of always avoiding conflict, right? Okay, so quick summary of all this, just becoming aware of these imbalances, bad habits, is the starting points. But if you want to keep avoiding conflict, if you want to keep having strategies to be really bad, just keep doing more of these in greater force and you will see it just work its wonder. And remember the whole thing about bad habits, you will have that skill permanently. You can be permanently really bad, and that muscle will never go away, which is what the scary thing about the automatic self is. Okay, so quick preview into a few slides into next week, which is all around how to train and break a bad habit. So I'm gonna first, I don't know if Brent's here on this class. Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe a little plug for him on Twitter if you want. And Brent, by the way, I found a class this size, or even with videos, you'll be lucky to get 5 new followers. So maybe if you want to be one of the 5, go follow him on Twitter, Brent French, smart man here. But the tweet that he had pinned, so I never actually looked at his profile until recently, and I was looking at it, and Megan's like, how'd you find this? And I was like, it's the one he pinned. And he said,
so spot on.
Like, the human capacity for avoidance is almost limitless. Meaning, have you ever asked the question, why are we so good at being so bad? You know, if we keep avoiding conflict, you know, that title slide, what did I say? Right? You avoid conflict to keep peace, but you start a war inside yourself. Talk about self-love, mindfulness, and all the stuff that we all want to do, which is love yourself first, the better me, before you can even be, you know, someone useful to anybody else in the world, the better you. Like, why are we so good at being so bad, right? Like, this idea that it's limitless. Like, how many creative ways we can avoid conflict. There's a earlier class we had also done, I think it was LIP 18, on how not to give feedback. If you want to go look at that, that has some good tactical ways to also avoid conflict, right? So if you want to get even better at this really bad muscle, go look at that, and that can give you some clues too. But this notion of, like, you know, when something happens where you're like, oh God, it's just, I do this all the time. People around me do this. Why do I do this? Like, is it really you just being that bad? Were you born the wrong way? Did you get the wrong vitamins? Did you, like, get diapered the wrong way? No, to understand why we're so good at being so bad, you have to go back into biology and understand the environment that we grew up in and what happened. And I think we gave a presentation in a LIP class, I think it was LIP 29, I think it was, 100-year change. And the 2 biggest things we found working with some of the best in the world of what changed the most from the 20th century to the 21st century is these 2 things: the speed to rise and the speed to fall of entire product lines, strategies, entire enterprises, but also of an individual. An individual performance, whether it's a sports athlete, a student, a child, an adult, the ability to suddenly rocket up, right? You said 20th century versus 21st, this is what it looks like. What used to move slower on a linear, slow path, literally you can change so fast. You will find that the best of the best can upgrade as in rocket up in less than 90 days. That's 3 months, and they can show you traction within 4 weeks, if not 2. Like, oh my God, like, as in people change that fast, but they can also fall just as fast. And the speed to rise and the speed to fall is just the difference of what changed between the 200-year centuries.
Sorry, let me just interrupt for one second. And Lindsay and Chris, I think you're asking similar-ish questions. We're going to get to more tactically. You know, Chris is just because I want to, so we can focus on this, but Chris is saying, you're not saying pick every battle. And then Lindsay's saying, how do we be more self-aware when we're avoiding conflict and not realizing it's going to lead down to practice.
Yes.
Just so you know. So it's not going to be picking the battle with everybody, but it is going to be practicing, because it's the only way you're going to build this muscle. You have to experience it. So we're going to get to that. Just if you can hold that for a second, we'll explain this, and then we'll get to the
So I first want to help you just not hate yourself so much, that why we're all like this.
We are like this for a reason.
Literally 100 years of society got trained to avoid conflict. Because the other part on the right here is the followership turning into decision makers. We shared this, so if you want to go back, you can, I won't show you what's on the slide fully, but this idea of what changed, you know, in the industrial age, which is the 100 years led up to year 2000, few people made decisions. Most of us just had to get the work done, right? So, you know how much easier it is to follow versus to have to make the calls yourself, right? And you know the number of calls you have to make, especially when the world moves as fast and the information moves as fast. See, in the old days, when it took 18 months just to get a report of what's happening on the market, you can make decisions slower. You can find out what's happening in the market within a few milliseconds now. So like, this amount of information, amount of stuff that we have to do to make decisions and judgment calls everywhere, that everyone's role in no matter what capacity, working or not and whatnot, you have to make the right calls, take the right forks in the road. And what's nice about just being a follower is I don't have to take the right forks. Someone decided the forks we take, and I just have to keep plowing down. You come into work practically drunk, just drink coffee, shower, and just plow ahead. We're talking about cranking through work, right? That's the old 100 years versus on decision making. It's a little different. And we had shared, some of the people we spent time with, the ones who did the post-mortem and the only nuclear meltdown ever in the United States, teams that went and analyzed what happened in Boeing. And you know what ended up happening in all these instances, 40 years apart, by the way, is all the same thing. They avoided conflict. They avoided conflict because that's what they're trained to do, right? Stay in your own lane. I see something going wrong, but then if I point it out, it might impact some other department. I'm a troublemaker. Right. So everyone stays quiet, right? And this idea of working between, it's like, think of assembly lines, right? You're just in charge of your part, not everyone else's. Even though everything is connected, you just kind of don't talk.
Well, Eden, because I like what you're saying, is avoiding conflict about keeping the peace or preserving yourself. Yeah, there's a part of trying to keep the peace in that kind of situation.
Which is that whole war inside, we said, right?
Yeah,
keep the peace.
If you're not trying,
preserving self.
But that's like, if you don't work with others and the work that you're doing doesn't connect to, and I think we still think we can just do our part, right? Like we can just go down the
meaning
assembly
nothing
line
is connected, right? Just assembly line, just my part's good enough.
Right.
Once it gets out of comes in my door, out the other door, right? Input, output, now it's your problem, not mine, right? But you know what ends up happening is oftentimes the idea of why people need to collaborate, right? I see something not quite right. We call that the NQR. Yeah. I'm sending something out that came into my door not quite right. Something's happening, but it's like, just gonna let it through, right? Because if I bring it up, now I have to have a conflict with the group that send it in my door, right? We found teachers, right? We did a lot of work with public school teachers. And they'll work between classes, and a teacher will say, the student that enters my class after your class always has behavioral issues. Yeah. And so they kind of don't know what to say because they want to say, I don't know what you're doing, but something you're doing as they exit your class creates a problem in my class. Right. But it's a lot easier to avoid that conflict, right? So I'll just deal with it here. And then I'll pass that on to the next person, right? And maybe they'll just, like this idea of not bringing up these conflicts, these assumptions. No different than the spouse. The more you work with them, the more you know. You have all kinds of data points of what you believe is their past, all kinds of data points of what they're going to do exactly into the future. But by not putting it on the table, they don't get to react and correct where your assumptions are wrong. And so this is a beautifully written piece of work, but the number one skill in the 21st century is the need to work well with others. I'm going to go into this a little bit more detail. But the number one point of failure is the inability to work well with others. There's a lot of people I meet these days that say, I just don't want to manage anyone. In fact, the question that we get a lot, right? Do I have to be a leader?
Oh, God.
Jesus.
How many times have you
been I just want to code. I just want to work. I just want to sell. Yeah. Do I have to be a leader?
Yes.
Right? I mean, how many times have you heard that question asked and no one knows how to answer it? And you're like, everyone should lead, so you should lead. But like this question of, do I have to be a leader? In many ways, the question they're really asking, do I have to work well with others? Whether it's a peer, whether it's a subordinate, whether it's a person above me, do I have to work well with others? And the answer is hell yes. So then, if you have to work well with others, this next question should come in, do I have to learn to not avoid conflict? And the answer is yes. And if you are answering no to these, right? It trickles all the way up to, do I have to be a leader? You can call yourself whatever the hell you want, right? Call yourself a leader, call yourself a collaborator, call yourself whatever it is, but you have to work well with others. And so the exact same skill we all need, you can't avoid it. Not in this century. You could in the old century when you had to follow.
That's the thing. And I think a lot of us remember like the end of that era where it felt like we even have investors like, I want everybody out. I plug my computer in. I do my thing. I don't want to deal with people. Let somebody else deal with that. It's like those days are gone. But some days I'm like, I just wish I could for an hour just go back to that. I remember those days 20 years ago.
Hit a button, make everyone disappear, and then you're like,
disappear for a minute, and I'm just going to do work that requires nobody else.
So this is a almost ending slide here, but the idea that change is not an option. So I'll go from the top to the bottom here. Think about speed. We said speed to rise, speed to fall, right? How fast things are moving. And then think about the fact that it's all about navigating decision making. We've been teaching the notion of what in the military called an OODA loop. An OODA loop is probably one of the best known decision making frameworks, which is bit in a tight OODA loop is someone who can make sense of stuff fast and make the right calls faster and faster, like turning like a turbo. If you do that, right, you can do things faster and better than anyone. But here's the catch. System 2 is what they call the computer AI logical brain. System 1 is another word for our intuition, our visceral, our EQ, right? Team system 1 is the only way this works. A system 1 alone is only right half the time, and there's very few games you can be a winner, right? Just by winning half the time and losing half the time. You need to do better than that. And the only way you can do better is to actually get team system 1 to occur. Collective intuition, the notion of collaboration. But the number one issue to collective intuition, two system 1s bumping heads, conflict is always there. There is no two human beings where their intuitions are identical, exactly the same, which means you're going to have conflict. It takes emotional energy, the drama, the time it takes, right? Oh my God, do I have to go and crush all the eggshells? It is painful, right? And when you do that in scale, as in conflict avoidance, we call avoiding organizational conflict. And the top thing in research they document that shows up is what they call org silence or organizational silence. It's a lot easier to avoid conflict. And so what do you want to talk about? How about the weather?
Yes.
How was Thanksgiving? Oh, see those turkeys this year? They're all smaller, right? We got real stuff going on that we need to talk about, but you know what? Let's talk about the turkey and then, hey, good luck on your work. Good luck. Oh, the pandemic again. Let's talk about the pandemic, right? Yeah. Think of it this way. The avoidance of conflict is the equivalent of saying we're not going to collaborate. Find me an organization, find me a team who literally can proudly say, this space, no collaboration, right? Our motto, our goal is no collaboration. When you avoid conflict, you might as well be saying, this is a no collaboration zone. This is a no collaboration team, a no collaboration enterprise, because I think hopefully it's obvious what that will do. First, that means system 1s generally must shut down, right? As in shut down, you can talk to yourself. You just can't talk to somebody else with system 1. Everything is about just giving system 2, like I'm going to give you a report, so then you can show me your report and we can just match up report to report, but the underlying assumptions made to make that report can't talk about, right? So like, you know, anything different showing up, we can't really argue or resolve, we have to avoid. And so when you do that, how fast can you move? Speed practically disappears. You can't move fast if you can't use system 1s as a team. You can't make good decisions in what is becoming an increasingly complicated unknown world if you don't use the human machine, which is system 1s meeting with other system 1s.
So two related questions. So sure. Kelly is asking a question. I think it's a good question. So Kelly's asking, how do you handle the conflict of a follower that doesn't want to make decisions, but doesn't like the decision made, right? Like the decisions, they don't like the decisions you're making, but they don't want to make the decision, right? So that's
sounds like a child
conflict. Yes, which happens all the time. There's a lot of followers, right, that just want to bitch about the decision made, but don't want to make the decisions, right?
So I'm trying to think of how to.
But and it's really
so the first thing I think about is this. That's a difficult person to work with, right? So I'm hoping you have more options than only that person, right? Now, if you're a parent, you may not have an option, but like that's a difficult person. Just recognize that, right? And oftentimes getting that difficult person who basically doesn't want to make a decision, but doesn't want to follow your decision, right, is just going to drive you crazy, right?
Yes.
So before you go and decide to go and blow your emotional tilt, like, you know, self on them, right? Again, for the umpteenth time, just recognize, maybe I could do that at 4 o'clock today, as opposed to starting at 9 in the morning. Because if you do have other options, it might actually help you
Yeah.
use more productive use of your energy before you go and like get all frustrated.
Mhm.
So just recognize the level of frustration that will come.
Mhm.
So then there's ways to train them, right? If you really want to go into it.
Mhm.
One thing that is usually commonly effective is find others like them. Like, you know how maddening it is when you put two people or more who are acting exactly the same way? Like, have you ever had like a friend who refuses to tell you, like they won't pick a restaurant, but every suggestion you make, they don't like it.
So annoying.
Put two people like that together and they get hungrier and hungrier. Watch what happens. Oh my God, is it like almost comical to watch from the perspective of someone who doesn't do that as often? Like at some point, hunger itself will make them do something.
I mean, this is related to
Right.
what Brent is asking. How do you handle teammates who refuse to be system one with you, right? You have people, you're trying to put out your intuition, your system one, and you're trying to rapidly go there and they're not doing it.
So I know we covered this in part of our tighter OODA loop thing. The idea of grouping the A's together, the B's together, the C's together, not the averaging grouping, right, for one.
Yeah.
But then you're asking the questions that go to the next part. So I'm like, this thing on the right, by the way, is the whole couples thing that I won't cover because I already talked about it.
Yeah, let's go.
But this is the final slide I want to touch on. So this was kind of a breakthrough moment for us. You've heard us say this before, practice does not make perfect. It's the pursuit of perfect practice that makes perfect. We're continually perfecting the practices. In looking at the OODA loop, which we covered, right, of how decision-making is done, and once again, if you've Google search OODA loop, wrong direction, we're telling you that the way to think of OODA loop is to think about 40% moting, right, which is reflecting and sharing to light your moat. And the 40% is kind of then the work of taking risk against taking, a cautious stance and paranoia feedback. And then we talked about practice, and I changed the word revenue to mission because I think this is more relevant. Imagine looking at this entire thing, not from a product perspective or a project perspective, but from a perspective of who. Let me say that again. When I think about this picture on the right is from the Navy. They talk about above the waterline, below the waterline. You can afford to try something in practice above the waterline, blow a hole in the ship, and it will look ugly, it will not make you look good, but it won't sink the ship. Blow a hole under the water, right? Below the waterline, you can sink the ship, hurt real people. Meaning in every case, there are things, which we call mission, that is too dangerous. You can't afford to underwrite a lot of risk. There are things above where despite looking bad, you can afford to underwrite the risk. And so in this case, imagine underwriting the risk of conflict going wrong versus there are who's where underwriting any risk of conflict going wrong is more difficult. Picture, instead of projects and events, just putting little faces of who's in different parts. What we found was this: the who matters most. The who's in our lives.
Conflict with somebody in your life that is what will more likely put you on tilt, make you say or do the things that you wish you could take back. It's saying don't practice on them. That's the game. Now you eventually have to, right? Because that's life.
No, not exactly, because see, the who's fall in different buckets.
Right.
You can't say, like, for example, one of our senior people, his name is Greg, right? Greg works on things, and our culture work is what we call practice, but our revenue work is what we call mission. But Greg is so important that it doesn't matter whether he touches culture or touches revenue. When there's conflict, the conflict spills into both sides. So Greg, for me and Megan, fall below the waterline. Doesn't matter what he works on, he's below the waterline. But they're individuals where, like, I can underwrite a conflict going wrong. That's the litmus test, right? The risk I'm willing to underwrite. Am I willing to underwrite if I go into conflict with this individual? It will look bad, either make them look bad, make me look bad, but is that going to sink the ship? Versus they're individuals, doesn't even matter how small it is, right? Like if conflict goes really wrong, right? That might not be risk I want to underwrite. And so we're going to go into this more next week, but the punchline really is this, that you can't think your way to changing your habits, your behaviors. This whole presentation hopefully gave you some aha moments, and you're probably walking away saying, this is really helpful, maybe not helpful, but like I've got some good insights. I hate to tell you, we're going to walk you through next week that all of this is worth 5%. The 95%, the more important part is the action. You have to be able to create that second muscle that's going to counteract your bad muscle that has come to you from 100 years of how the world's worked. And so how to build that when it comes to conflict, we're going to go into the depth of practice isn't what it's about perfect practice. And perfect practice, we had said in one of the earlier classes, is an ongoing journey of continual iteration. But the practice, instead of thinking projects and whatnot, I want you to think about little pictures of people's faces. Some people for you will fall into that upper above the water line. Yeah. Some people will be below the water. And people move over time too, right? I mean, usually if you have a new hire, they tend to be above the water line because like, I feel like as a new hire, you can almost do no wrong. All they say, I'm sorry, I didn't know I'm new. And at the same time, for me, it's a new hire. So it's like easier to correct them. You know, it's the idea of like they say when you're first married, anything wrong, we're all open to talking about how to do better. The longer you're married, how dare you bring that up? You want to bring up your issues? So they say when you get married, you should have marriage counseling before you get married. Because we always wait till it goes all to hell and then we try to counsel our way out of it. But it's like just really difficult. It's easier in the beginning. One of the things we tend to do wrong, of course, even in new hires is there's a great CEO who told me, hey, Charlie, whatever you see in the first 2 weeks or even up to the first month, that is them on their absolute best behavior. So just recognize that, right? So, but if you see them now like do stuff wrong, there are some times where people can grow and change, but we tend to let them off the hook, right? They're just new. That's the Prison Westmore creation. I'm just going to go and create Prison Westmores now, as opposed to imagine aggressively going into a new hire, tell them, hey, why'd you do that? That's not right, and have them try again. And the new hire is like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm new here. Even they will take it better. So their new hires are great practice ground in many ways. Yeah.
We should take some questions. There's a few in here that I want to get to. Do you guys want to take a minute and just throw in some questions into the chat? So we just threw a lot at you, and there's some good questions in here. I mean, there's just a lot of, this is such a thought-provoking topic.
So I put it in small slide. Here, I'll look at the chat with Megan. So if you want a slide you mean to zoom into, I could, but I just set it so you can see everything. Okay, so someone asked about a sticky note on slide 10. Wait, slide 10 is the sticky note.
Hold on, we're muted.
Oh,
you're not muted. Okay. Yeah, we know we're unmuted. Sorry, we're talking through the questions.
So some really good questions. First question I think that Megan was showing me was it from Lindsay?
Lindsay, I think your question is really good, and I'm thinking about it. It's the last 5 minutes I've been chewing on it, right? Which is how do you recognize when you're avoiding conflict? You said, how do we be more self-aware when we're avoiding? I don't know if you want to unmute, Lindsay, if you're still here and maybe not realizing.
Yeah, my question was just around just trying to be more self-aware when we're trying to avoid conflict, because there are times that we may not even realize that it's something really important that we need to provide feedback on, and we miss that opportunity because we're in such a habit of playing the passive role because we don't want to rock the boat.
Right.
So can I give you sort of my very rapid most default? Just recognize you suck at conflict. Right? Just because we all are.
Because we all are.
Like, I think that's the first place to start, because you'll know when you're really good. And usually it's because you're going to a lot of danger and that's your default. Yeah. And people around you look at you like, oh my freaking God, I can't believe you did that. Right. Like, you'll stand out like a sore thumb. if you get practice at not avoiding conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So the first place I started is, let's just all be fair to ourselves. 100 years of organizational behavior and the way we're trained and whatnot, we all suck at conflict. Let's start there.
Right.
So when you see something, the first thing I'm thinking is, God, I suck at this, right?
Yeah.
But we all do. So that's the part you should feel good about. But then next we'll go into training. And when you start training, you'll be shocked how bad you are. You'll be shocked at like how you'll do it once and then you'll lie again.
I'll tell you just from personal experience, I'm practicing this because this is a huge topic for me. One of my largest development areas for the last like 20 plus years. It is so, I conflict on myself. It's why I'm a good student. I do not mind critical feedback. I will do it publicly. I will grow and learn. For somebody else, doing it for somebody else, my God, it's like a completely different, but I feel the intuition. I will leave a meeting and I will unleash all I know what's wrong. I just can't tell them that. So it's so hard to do this. Even over email, my intuition reaction is, oh God, and I have all these thoughts. Literally seconds later, when I go to type my response, it's like I'm a completely different person. It's like, I appreciate your thoughts. It's like, we're trained to be, pleasant and nice and we're trying to keep the peace and all those things. But I'm literally seconds prior, I'm thinking all these things, but within seconds, I'm responding with a completely different, it's that hard. It's so ingrained in us. So seconds later, he had to watch me do it. He was like, I can't believe you, because it's that hard.
Like, one of the greatest practice grounds is email. If you get an email from someone, you have literally a visceral reaction. And so like, if you are next to someone and you just say out loud what your reaction is, right? And so like May had a reaction. I was like, oh, that's exactly what I think too. Or like, that's really insightful. Like, and then as soon as she starts writing, starts with, I appreciate. And I was like, whoa. Your reaction was, oh God, I can't believe, but you started with, I appreciate, and then went off the rails. And I was like,
or the first one I give is real raw truth. And then their response isn't really matching. And I know it's not quite right, as in they're kind of skirting issues. They're not really giving me the answer. They're kind of dodging. And I'm thinking kind of like WTF in my head, but then I write back. Then I find a way to say, you know what?
I feel like
I can see the logic in that response. I can see why they would do that. And then that's the whole, I can't keep a consistent truth. So I'm willing to let them off the hook so fast.
I think Mary Covance, can you unmute, ask what you asked? Because I think this is tied to maybe where you're going.
And Mary, if you unmute, she was going like this when you said, you'll know when you're good at conflict. I have a feeling Mary's good at conflict.
Mary, can you unmute and ask?
And she's like, I don't know. I don't want to.
No?
Oh, you can't unmute? Oh, she can't unmute. Okay.
Let's see. Maybe
Okay.
Here, I'll try to unmute you.
Okay, wait. Oh, here. Post it in. Do you want to put something in the chat? Oh, she said, looking forward to when I'm direct, I get the feedback.
Go ahead, Mary.
Oh, she gets feedback that she shouldn't be so direct. See, she's a conflict person. She'll go there.
I can't hear Mary, but
I think her mic is broken.
Okay.
The mic is broken. You know what?
She's
computers.
So she's saying, looking forward to learning more, because when I'm direct, I get the feedback that I shouldn't.
So here's the practice, right? Remember, like something that we have not trained a lot in, we're going to be very bad. I think we had shared in one of the earlier lib classes the notion of what they call obnoxious aggression, right? Asshole. I sense, Mary, you might be labeled asshole. I've been labeled that many times as well. Now, the intention is not that. But as you get better, you get what they call tough love. You want to get to a place where you can be direct, but you can also have compassion. But it's not compassion, then toughness. Yeah. That's like usually one of the cruelest things. It's like everyone gets like, oh, wow, I thought I'm doing well. And then you come with a subtle punch.
Right.
As opposed to, hey, this is going to hurt. They brace for it.
Yeah.
Tough. And then you show them, and I'm giving you this because I know you can do better. That's the tough love you want to get to. It takes practice, which is why you need to be aware of where your below the waterline people are versus you're above the waterline. You don't want to go to your manager, your CEO, or whoever's the person most in charge and say, you know what, I'm just so good at being direct, I'm just going to lay it on them. Because if you do it wrong, right, there's a high cost. And usually when we are direct and aggressive, we don't recognize the assumptions we have underneath our directness. Assumptions on their past, assumptions of what they will do in the future. So there's a part of you can be direct, but then you have to be open-minded to be shifting gears when you find your assumptions are wrong. So the ability to, we call that ladders of inference, share with them all of that openly so they can then correct it.
Yeah.
That's a skill that takes practice. The one I was looking at, Mary, you had written also was around a collaborative team, right? If you recognize someone is avoiding conflict, but you embrace feedback, how can you get them to be more open with you? It's so easy to accept when someone you're working on is avoiding
conflict that you end up avoiding yourself.
So one of the interesting things, this notion of think a lot about balance and imbalances. When someone goes and spends emotional energy, right, which is usually giving feedback or responding, right, goes into a difficult topic. I look at the response and look at how balanced or imbalanced is their emotional investment back. One of the ugliest things and skeeziest things is I spent this time taking a risk trying to help, or maybe it could be hurtful, but I'm putting emotional energy, and they write back, thanks, noted. And I'm like, it's a bit of a what the fuck, right? Like you can watch, and by the way, it doesn't mean they have to write as long an essay. It's just, it's matching your investment with their investment back. It doesn't have to match exactly, but it has to directionally be close enough, as opposed to I put 90 and they put 1 or 0. And so.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sorry, I'm going to throw this out with Laura, because Laura moderated, and we've worked really closely together. It's reminded me, just because, I'm putting myself out there. We're just all going to share our stuff because this is that hard. I've had situations with Laura too, where conflict is so hard, I think, for both of Laura and I. So I'm trying to go there, but I can sense she doesn't really want to. So then, or I'm getting nervous. So then it's easy for us both to avoid it. Right. And so that's what's really hard. When two people, I think nobody wants to go into conflict is the reality, right? Nobody wants to do that. But I found that sometimes that notion of an LBR, we call bring it to light, take a break, and then revisit. I found it easier. I remember Laura once with you was something with Flagship. I emailed you hours later, something I was trying to bring up and I couldn't, you know what I mean? You need a little bit of a break sometimes. I think trying to force conflict when it's just not happening in that meeting you're in or that setting, sometimes you just need like a little break, and then to revisit it again, you're going to get more reception, right? Because it's hard for both people. It's hard to bring up conflict, and it's hard to be the receiver of the difficult, whatever the conflict is. So I don't know. And I experienced that with Charlie and I too, where it's like sometimes you just need a hot minute and then you can hear it and start processing it and go into it.
Mm-hmm. No, and I know one of the things, like it seems like we're teaching you just to fight, right? Yeah. Go pick every fight, have conflict everywhere. It's not that. We're trying to teach you to win.
Yeah.
And if you're going to win, right, in today's day and age, you need to learn how to make decisions fast. Mm-hmm. There's nothing faster in decision making than the ability to bump your system 1 intuitive brain with another human being's system 1 brain. But the minute you do, the thing that will stop you from using that muscle is conflict, because there will be issues you do not agree on, and they'll be small enough that you want to let it go, let it go, let it go. So we'll cover this more next week too. It's what we call the boiling frog syndrome, right? Like, I don't know if you ever heard that, where if you put a frog in hot water, it jumps out. But if you put a frog in warm water and then bring it to a slow boil, the frog just endures, and then eventually can't even jump out because it spent all this energy compensating for the things that they should have reacted on earlier. So we had that in the parking lot slide, but
you can go into it next week.
Sorry,
too.
Jesse
Yeah,
had
Jesse, a good question. I was just looking at that.
Yeah.
Right.
Are you here, Jesse?
Yeah,
I think it's Jesse. Gesi.
Yeah, this is
Yeah.
from New York City.
Hi. Yeah, it's Gacy, by the way.
Oh, Gacy. Okay.
Yeah. No, I was just wondering about some tips on calling out. I think that we are taught niceness as like an almost performative kind of thing in work and even social settings. Mm-hmm. So what are some tips on being the receiving end, calling that out to get to the root of what we're of the feedback that we're trying to get to?
So meaning you want the critical feedback.
Right. You can tell that someone is like uncomfortable, and you're just like, it's okay. We can just get to the.
Yeah. So that's seeking.
So there's a couple of things that I think about first. We had taught in one of the earlier classes this notion of horseshoe coaching. Horseshoe coaching starts with looking at results, metrics, trending performance. Like this question of what are you trying to accomplish? Like, you don't need to go and be that direct. But like, imagine me walking the street, seeing a stranger and bump into them, and then like, hey, can I just give you some direct feedback on your outfit and the way you smell? And that's unnecessary, right? In fact, that's stupid. I think what matters is this, teams are together to accomplish something. Like, and the greater the mission, right? The greater the need for a stronger team. And it's like initial business plans, initial project plans, usually everyone gets along. You just have to start, and then the issues start popping up, which is when you start to see issues you didn't know about, and like metrics aren't going the way you want and whatnot. And so this idea of, you first need to think about the mission. I think, in fact, we had this in one of the parking lot sites, the flashlight.
The flashlight.
Like, are you, if you're driving in a car together, do you have the flashlight shining out? So imagine if your headlights are broken, you have a flashlight, looking at where you're trying to go together, or are you just looking at each other? And oftentimes, like, we're not looking at the mission. We're so busy looking like this. So the thing I think about first is make sure the majority of the time the flashlight's out to the mission. We do a quick glance here, but it changes the emphasis. And oftentimes, without talking about the situation or the mission,
as in it's not an axe to grind. We're trying to get something done,
it is
accomplish
painful
something.
and energy draining to grind an axe at every human being that crosses your life, right? So like, based on the mission and what you need to get done, you're gonna be able to see like who's a better teammate and who's not, right? In fact, there are oftentimes we are in teams that were not set by us, set by somebody else, and we need to figure out how to win. But then we go into these victim narratives of, I have to win exactly with the way it's set. Oh no, there's hundreds of workarounds and ways to win.
But I think there are ways tactically to invite the critical feedback. We call, seeking feedback skills. There are ways, if you really want to know the truth, really want to know, you can throw out what you think they might be dancing around. Do you think I'm this? Do you think I'm, I'm gaming the system? Do you think I'm selfish? Do you think I don't work well with people? Or you can throw it out and let them sort of be like, well, not that, but kind of this, because I think
we talked about this.
If you really want to know.
We talked about this. So there is a slide that we didn't go into, probing.
Oh, yes.
We haven't taught this, but it's something that we want to teach somewhere. It's this. I don't know if you ever shared this slide. Yes, no, maybe. But it has to do with the idea of first self, right? Think about self driving something, alertness and whatnot. But then oftentimes when we have to work with somebody else, so doing work versus leading, the left side is what you need. You need to be able to observe what's happening, and you need the ability to probe, right? Probe is another word for feedback seeking in some ways. And so before you have to be flexible and agile to change what you're going to do, right? So I'm just going to go into a little bit on this notion of probing. We had shown before this idea of recognizing when you're in emotional tilt, right? Which is the moat, the mother of all thematic errors in human beings, the moat. When you feel flip-flopping anywhere between desperation and shame, right? You're not in a good place to go and get feedback, right? Because if you want them to give you more real truth, you won't even really try to draw out the real truth because it might make you look really bad. I'm so ashamed. I want to hide. I'm not going to say, hey, do you think I really suck? Like, you're going to be like, do you think I could do maybe a little bit better?
Right.
Like, are you not fully happy with my work? Like, you can feel the timidness versus like someone who can probe out good reaction, good feedback is calm, is not on tilt. And the other person can feel them, like almost like I can insult myself in extreme ends better than you could possibly say. But if I'm like, whoa, you say that and that's it, I'm out, that's someone who has a large moat. So the notion of being aware if you're on tilt, as in how large your moat is, right? Because by the way, we always have moats, gives you a sense of if you can get feedback or not, draw out critical feedback.
Yeah.
Which is valuable. You need to be able to draw out, like, and this is the part we talked about in the OODA loop, people forget. It doesn't matter until you action. So many of us think that, oh my God, I put that out there, now I look like an idiot, right? And now they're insulting me. I'm like, does it matter? They didn't do anything with it. They just pointed out a major flaw you're about to take. Thank God for that horrible feedback, but like you can now adjust and do something different. Like this idea that it doesn't really matter until you action. And so when you're better and have a tighter OODA loop, you're better at actually putting out there things that people can react to. And the easier it is to react to it, the better decision you will ultimately make. And that's creates a tighter OODA loop.
Yeah, I mean, Dana, I didn't realize I was like, Dana, it was another Dana. It's our Dana. But this notion of feeling like a hothead, like you're trying to be calm and giving the critical feedback. They're not listening, right? They're not hearing you. And so you dial up your conviction and emotion, and then after you feel like a hothead, and you're like, why did I do that? So I relate, Dana. This is like one of the reasons why I won't go there, because when I do go there, it is a little scary
Yes.
for everybody, including myself. Like, I don't want to have to do that.
So it's interesting. We taught this in one of the earlier classes. We call that being unaware, right? That unaware state is the equivalent of being startled. When you become that version of yourself you're not proud of, which we all do enough times, right? You're startled, like, because you never planned to do that.
Yeah, you never planned to do that.
You're startled. You're startled when you have a large moat. If you have unprocessed things that you feel ashamed about, you have unprocessed things that you feel desperate about, you're going hoping that no one saw that or no one calls it out. But the minute they get in the vicinity of close and you blow up, that is a moat. That is you, right? Because you hadn't properly, reduced the size of your moat, you actually weren't able to truly get in the game and play the game properly. I think of it like a visual. If you are in the middle like a castle and there's a water moat, remember it's raining every day, right? And at the drawbridge, when the moat's too big, you can't get to the other side. You need to reduce this moat to be able to get to the other side. Moat will always be there, but it's got to be at 49% in the minority before you can operate. Because when you go out there and someone can put you on tilt, emotional tilt too easily, it's just a signal that like you haven't processed this, right? Which, by the way, we all do. So then it's like, oh, did that tell me something about me more than them? I lost it. Like, why'd you lose it? Like, is there something that they said? Like, this idea that no one can really make you feel shame. No one can make you feel desperate more than yourself. There's nobody in this world that can make you feel more stupid, more shameful, more desperate than yourself. Right. The number one individual who is a terrorist in your life is yourself. There's others, of course, but when we listen to them, we bring them into our life, we repeat their message over and over again. And I'm like, so how many times do you talk to this person? Once. How many times do you tell yourself the dumb advice they gave you? I don't know, thousands of times, hundreds of times. You're doing it to yourself, but we're often unaware of it. And so this notion of the moat. See, what lip class covered the moat? I cannot remember, but there was a lot.
We covered it last week, 2 weeks ago, and the week before. So the week before Thanksgiving, so probably 32 and 31. Shayna, I missed your question. I don't know if you're still, Shauna. I don't know if you're still here. Shauna. Yeah. Shauna, are you still here?
Yeah,
if you want to ask. Oh,
you
are.
Yeah. Hi. Good morning. I think you just answered it, Charlie. I was just talking about as you are aware of your moat, because mine is shame, big time. So as I'm aware, to try and jump into the practice of not avoiding conflict, that to me, I'm trying to find it is possible, but I need to be very careful because I'm still working on the tight OODA loop and moat and reducing my moat. Because as soon as you said you will react, I'm thinking, maybe I'm doing too much thinking in my head and I need to just practice rather than just continue to be in shame and be like, well, I'm not the greatest leader yet, so I can't really go into the conflict arena in a good way, in a healthy way. So that was it. And just listening to that was helpful.
So Shauna, right? You know what, I think I mentioned this, what the practicing and reducing your moat is? It literally is like, how they say to kill COVID, one way is sunlight, the other way is like the UV rays and whatnot. There's like a laser ray to kill COVID, right? Bringing it to light to another human being. When you're saying I'm journaling it, talking to myself, that's not how you kill it. It's like killing COVID with sunlight. Bringing it to light is how you kill it. So for example, like when you said, I feel shame, I'm Korean, this and that, like you have to talk to another human being. Ideally, remember the insider versus outsider? Anybody better than nobody, but insider is always better. And then if the person, also doesn't have a large moat, because sometimes when you say, I feel shame in my career, someone says, oh my God, me too. Let's not talk about it. It makes both of us. Now, versus someone who has curiosity. Yeah. Can you give me the ladders of inference? Yeah. Give me some details. I might even start writing it down in front of you, right? So you have shame on this and go into detail and whatnot. And as you start to put what this demon in your head of shame on paper in front of someone and explain it, right? And then you might have like this ugly doodle diagram, right? And then you kind of like keep it out. And then you keep adding to it. You keep adding to it. The act of bringing it to light is what kills it. Never fully, but down to 49%. We never kill it because we keep it in the ether, like living in our head. You need to be able to share it with another human being. And the more descriptive and the more depthful and detailed it is actually the way to dial it down, to basically make it non-infectious. So like when someone brings something up, I mean, I've done a lot of bad things in my life, like mistakes and errors. Like, I was a young CEO. Now I can chalk it up to God, how stupid I was as a young CEO. But like, I think about it, I'm like, yeah, that's horrible stuff. But you'll see that my emotions process so that although it's shameful then, I don't have the shame now.
Right.
I can look for the lessons from it. And in fact, it's crazy. The very thing that you're so shameful about, you will be able to teach and share with others how that was the turning point of when you learned this, that, and you can start to use empathy now as a leadership tool. Oh my God, like, let me give you a story about me and what I did and how bad it was and whatnot. But when I look back now, that is when I started to change. That is what I learned in this idea of, there's a guy years ago, one of my mentors told me, Charlie, there's no oh my gods and there's no mistakes in life. There's only lessons learned. Whatever that oh my God is now, it's cheaper made now than later. So it's a hard way to kind of process and actually in practice live. But if you really can see things as, there's no oh my gods and no less, no mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, by the way, short term, there's always oh my gods and always mistakes. But you get better and better at starting to look for the lessons from it and then get to try again. And the best examples I always give, we have a lot of engineers, right? And a lot of them love playing video games. I always tell them, when they lose in the video game, they want to try again, right? And thank God for autosave. I mean, when I grew up, you had to put quarters in. So it's like you start all the way from the beginning and Jesus, it's like, but now it's autosave. So you just have to continue from the spot, basically. It brings you up to the mistake. They won't stop. They want to try again, try again, try again. Like, that's the mindset you want to get to. Give me another shot, right? Coach, put me back in. Give me another shot. I'll learn my lesson. Like, but to do that, you have to process mode. Because imagine you make the mistake and, oh my God, they all think I suck now.
Yeah.
They finally discovered the real me, which is, I don't know what I'm doing. Oh my God, oh my God. Well, so the good thing, everyone is doing the same thing. Everyone's moding in the same way and all acting all puffed up and good, but they're all really, oh my God, maybe someone will notice what I suck at. And so we all do that. But you can get to a place where like, you're like able to go into a face plant of like, God, that hurt. And God, that was embarrassing, right? You can even talk about it.
Make fun of
And then be
yourself.
like, all right, if I try it again, maybe a different approach. You'll see people who have large moats, they do the same thing over and over again and keep talking about how it didn't work. And I'm like,
Yeah,
no video game player ever plays that way, right? Yeah. Unless they're just frustrated and just want to show you how frustrated they are. And I'm like, stop playing them. Like, that's video games. Okay.
Thank you. That was awesome. Thanks.
As always, we would love your feedback if it wasn't in here in the feedback app. And yeah, it's always good seeing you guys.
Yeah, it's good questions, you guys. This is a tough topic. We're going to cover more obviously next week in details, and we have some really interesting stuff we're still working on in the lab around how to change these habits. It's not easy stuff.
So at least
I'll tell you from my practice, I'm in the arena, so we'll go into the detail.
Yeah, it's not easy stuff. It's not easy, but once again, this is if remember, you have 100 years of reasons and excuses of why we suck at this. So don't think you're bad because you're bad.
Mm-hmm.
We're all trained this way. Now that muscle we will never lose. That's the key part. We need to build this counter muscle, and so this is where you got to train like pros. And perfect practice is what will make us better at this. So we'll touch some of that next week.